Unsettling, right? This piece by Arne Melnäs was commissioned in 1970 for a children's choir competition among Scandinavian countries, and I would be surprised if anyone goes through the whole thing without cringing or wincing. It's crazy how a bundle of sound frequencies, faceless, colorless, even for the most part wordless, can elicit such a strong emotional response, particularly one of unease, maybe even to the extent of fear. Fortunately, though, through a psychoanalytic lens, this affective reaction can be defined, studied, and explained using the Freudian terminology of the uncanny. How can bodiless, invisible music feel uncanny? In his 1919 essay, The Uncanny, Freud theorizes the eponym and suggests two experiences that can produce it. First, the strange made familiar, or what we'll call consonance. This relates to the things that are supposedly strange and unknown, yet feel close and personal, precisely because we can relate them to our own repressed emotional impulses that emerge once again. And second, the irrational made possible, or what we'll call dissonance, referring to frightful things that make us feel ill at ease, uncomfortable in our own natural experiences, because of the inability of our minds to rationally make sense of them. Using this psychoanalytical framework, we'll examine a glepta, attempting to pinpoint what exactly it feels uncanny by finding musical elements that can either make the strange familiar or the irrational possible. Usually when we remember, our minds wander towards a concrete memory, floating on the surface of our consciousness, one easily accessible if you were to just reach out and touch it. Other times, though, the world sinks a stick into the depth of our consciousness, long enough to poke the drowsing, repressed bear within it, waking it up, winding it up, making it angry. This is where the uncanny manifests. Freud defines the specific occurrence of the uncanny as the class of the terrifying, which leads back to something long known to us, once very familiar. As a species, human beings have developed a survival instinct that derives from the earliest days of primate existence, fight or flight, a set of repressed physiological and psychological responses to threatening situations, buried deep within us that the uncanny may trigger. Let's take a look at rhythm in music. Accelerating tempo might suggest a chase or the heavy breathing of a frightened person. Inversely, slowing down the beat might indicate lurking evil or a fading heartbeat. And that is not merely interpretive, but sometimes can have empirical affective responses in the listeners who might notice their heartbeats be affected by the pulses. That is because pulsating rhythms are easily comparable to footsteps and heartbeats. Upon hearing and locating these initially unmusical elements within a musical composition, the strange, we make a link with our repressed survival instincts, the familiar, and they suddenly become the uncanny. Let's try something using Apple's GarageBand on our phone and try to think about how the change of pace makes you feel. Dynamics in a composition refers to how loud or soft notes are played. Listen to this section of Carl Orff's O Fortuna. It is not so much the dynamic itself, but the sudden change in dynamic that creates a powerful response. Going suddenly from soft to loud naturally induces a startling effect, which then triggers our fight or flight. Inversely, going from loud to soft creates a window for the listener's recuperation from the loudness, a finally moment that can also be translated into an ostensibly false sense of safety as we anxiously anticipate the next startle. Playing shrill, high notes or low droning synths can also be interpreted as uncanny, where musical instruments start to sound too similar to other familiar and universally unpleasant sounds: crying, screaming, and growling. Pink Floyd's Speak to Me iconically begins with a woman's piercing scream. Maybe in pain, maybe in distress, but the choice to include that in their composition certainly leaves the listeners feeling uneasy. But then they go and use an ebow in the opening of Echoes. The vibrating guitar string sounds almost exactly like the wail of a widow. Here, both our fight or flight and our protective instincts are triggered. We don't know if we'd rather flee or confront this threat, or even comfort the thing or person producing the crying and screaming. A low droning synth can also trigger the uncanny for its extreme resemblance to growling, emulating, for instance, the threat of a wild animal. Take a listen. Hearing kids' voices in compositions also feels uncanny, most obviously because it directly reminds us of lullabies, nursery rhymes, and even our own childhood self and its repressed complexes. What heightens this uncanny feeling is our learned understanding of lullabies as innocent and pure, which almost directly opposes our actual experience of them as eerie and unsettling. Historically, this paradox is very evident, as most nursery rhymes derive from essentially murder ballads. Ethnomusicologist Andrew Petit argues that every song can practically be a lullaby if you slow it down enough and sing it softly. But then, why are lullabies so dark? He suggests that the lyrics are not exactly for the child. I mean, obviously, they're for the parents. Lullabies and their words tend to express feelings of parents' anxiety, particularly of a child in danger. They were, in fact, originally first used in Babylon as magic spells to protect the babies from these very anxieties. Take Rockabye Baby, for instance. When the bow breaks, the cradle will fall, and down will come baby, cradle and all. This clearly embodies the anxiety of a cradle death. As such, hearing a lullaby, a kid singing, or even the soft melody of the Celeste not only throws us back into that cradle, but also places us in a parent's shoes with an impending sense of loss and grief, hence rendering it undeniably uncanny. The last thing we'd like to talk about when it comes to the uncanny induced by consonance or remembrance is religious connotations in music. The pipe organ is a recurring master instrument in church music. Interestingly enough, it also happens to be a recurring master instrument in horror music as well. Music can have varying levels of connotation to religions, whether through the lyrics taken out of biblical text or through the mere presence of the classical religious musical element, the choirs. Singing choirs are an integral part of religious rituals, from the church choirs in Christianity to the adhan in Islam to Hindu sacrifices and Buddhist puja. Whenever a group of people come together and begin singing, we are immediately reminded of worshipping and the close relationship between believers who sing and a God who listens. And the reason why this moment of remembrance feels particularly uncanny lies within the very nature of religion, a fear-based set of beliefs. Religion reminds us of our mortality and of our mere ephemeral existence in the grand scheme of things. So it wouldn't be surprising to get triggered whenever the music we're listening to has any connection to religion whatsoever. Some musical elements, however, are hard to explain and don't really resonate with our past experiences. Instead of cognitive consonance, then, we are faced with a sort of dissonance, a term referring to both the musical discordance and the cognitive dissonance it generates within us.
Musical dissonance is an important tool when creating uncanny horror music. When two very different musical notes are combined, our ears are met with a disturbing sound. This sonic tension is not only unpleasant in a physical way, but also on a cerebral level. As described by Recording Arts Canada, a music school with a campus here in Montreal, dissonance creates a sense of unease within the listener due to our brain's difficulty with rationalizing the ratio relationship between the frequency of the notes and their clashing overtones. Viewers and listeners are sensitive to what feels right and what does not, especially after years of watching and listening to horror films with elaborate soundtracks. This is like a training of sorts, in which our fight or flight response becomes automatically triggered without a second thought. Musical dissonance as a concept is a non-narrative way of inciting terror. The reading by Myers and Waller on Dissenstoried Horror explores the ways in which we can feel horror without a storyline that justifies the emotion. To problematize this, they propose that horror is created from much more than ontological elements. They use the example of a monster. It is not that there is an issue with the world because of a horrifying monster that we are scared, which is ontological, but perhaps we are scared because there is something wrong, but we are not sure what it is, epistemological. A lack of knowledge, meaning the unknown, is scary because we cannot predict what will happen, leaving us in a state of instability. Music is of course capable of this in a non-narrative sense. Myers and Waller propose what is key is the suggestion that there is more to the story, but the narrative cannot be understood. So whether we don't understand the lyrics or there's an absence of lyrics to begin with, this leaves us again to deal with the unknown. The same could be said for the use of dissonance as a concept. Musical dissonance is confusing for the brain. What note am I hearing? Is it one note, two, three? Even without a narrative, this discordance creates an irrational fear and discomfort, thus perfectly in line with the uncanny.
Here's a major interval. Happy, right? Now a minor interval. A little bit sadder. But the idea here is that even if it's a negative emotion, at least we can understand the sadness induced by the minor chord. Now listen to this interval where the notes are 5 semitones apart. This particular interval is so uncomfortable that it has been baptized by music theorists as the devil's interval, or the tritone. We'll pitch it up. Does it remind you of any iconic film scene? Exhales are a set of 4 notes that are semitones apart, played together. One last example of dissonance are sound masses or tone clusters. I'll show you using my actual little organ, as GarageBand doesn't really support that. A particularly popular example of dissonance is Krzysztof Penderecki's polymorphia. So here, it's not so much the relationship between the notes, as they all blend together and create a texture that is itself unsettling.
As we move away from the general concept of uncanny music, we can step into its usage in horror films. As we have seen in class, sound and even silence can amplify the fear and discomfort we feel when watching a horror film. The sound effect of a bullet piercing a zombie or the ominous footsteps of a figure we cannot see are essential for scaring a filmgoer. Yet in less obvious or explicit scenes, a regular mundane moment can turn into a frightening scene and tell the viewer that something is off just by the soundtrack. A classic example of this is someone sharpening a knife in a kitchen, a very common, non-scary thing to do, and yet putting horror music over it will notify us that something bad will happen. To exemplify this in the most extreme way, we juxtapose an uncanny musical piece over an otherwise joyful clip of Disney's earliest Mickey Mouse. Notice how the original version makes you feel versus our edited one. It's fair to say that the original Mickey Mouse clip presents us a fun, adventurous scene where Mickey even whistles to the music to express his joy. The edited version, on the other hand, suggests that maybe Mickey's not so innocent. Perhaps he is on his way to murder someone or there's a danger on the boat. Now that we have established the power of scary music, we can rewind a bit to the techniques Kevin previously described and see how they work in some iconic horror movie scenes.
We can start with the opening of The Shining, that begins with a rendition of a popular Gregorian chant, with its slow pulses and droning synths. Already, we can locate rhythm, registers, and religious connotations. Then, this clip from The Shining demonstrates the expert use of texture in order to amplify the chaos in the iconic elevator scene.
It is extremely difficult to pinpoint what exactly it is that we're hearing because the overlap of unidentifiable instruments, sounds, and chants, and even possibly piercing whispers, create an amalgamation of fear. We found some more examples of scary film soundtracks in an article released by Premium Beat, a sound effects production company, that dives into music and horror. The first clip, for example, demonstrates the significance of dissonance that we have maintained throughout this presentation. This is a song from the soundtrack of Midsummer titled Gassed. The single violin rises with tension and then is met by a second, unexpected violin note that completely opposes the harmony of the original one. The use of pulsating rhythms can create a fear coated in anxiety, as we all know very well from the soundtrack of Jaws. Without these rhythms, this scene may very well be understood as a beautiful, serene moment on the beach.
The faster the pulses, the closer the threat of the human-eating shark gets. Lastly, how can we not mention the iconic shower scene from Psycho, chopped up into pieces by its piercing violin? The fast repeated hits are called stingers, which, coupled with the devil's interval tritone, create one of cinema's most chill-inducing soundtracks.
On a different note, it's also interesting to explore how music that doesn't have these uncanny qualities can also be scary. This usually occurs in a sort of opposite formula that we were previously discussing. Rather than using pleasant visuals with horror music, one can create the same amount of fear, and sometimes even more by playing an otherwise pleasant song over unpleasant visuals. Take this clip from Insidious, for example. This can be understood as irony or misplacement. This 1968 song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips by Tiny Tim, is about a joyous, innocent moment of strolling through a flower garden. This context obviously does not match the storyline of the film. This clip allows the viewer a look into what the evil demon is doing, therefore very much not in tune with the song's lyrics. This clash could maybe even be compared to the technique of musical dissonance, giving us the feeling that two components do not belong with one another.
We've seen how music can inherently be scary, and how it can render visuals even scarier. And when it comes to the horror genre, a lot of people can agree, music is a big part. And when we say a lot, we mean it. A lot of people. Because horror is a cult genre, with a huge fan base. Fans who watch, react, who shit themselves. But most importantly, fans who participate in it. But why is that important? A fundamental element of film viewing is obviously the audience and their experience of the film. Because is there really a film if no one's watching? And with the evolution of the genre, by consciously repurposing certain sounds and musical elements in scary movies, filmmakers and audiences come together to construct a canon of conventionally scary music. If we were to take, for instance, the meowing of a cat, and use it repeatedly in horror films for several years to come, it is bound to reach a point where every cat's meow becomes inherently terrifying. Meow! It's possible then that scary music is scary only because we put it in scary films in the first place. In reality, what may have felt uncanny to generations past may go totally unnoticed by most people today, which makes the uncanny in music a mutable and evolving, a living and social concept. This is, we think, what makes scary music so enjoyable, because we know deep down that its uncanny qualities are experienced beyond the personal. When watching a scary movie, and specifically when reacting to scary music, we react as a collective, as an ensemble, as an audience, which makes the pain a tiny little bit less tragic and a little more enjoyable. So, we've reached the end. We've talked about music, about sounds, about screams and cries and organs and devils and intervals and exhales and remembrance of dissonance, of survival, of religion and texture and sound masses and lullabies and... But watch what happens when we just... Right? Silence can be as loud as the music itself, especially in horror films. As Robert Spadoni writes in his text, The Uncanny Body, the horror genre created a new sense of fear and instability with the advent of sound films. He states that the coming of sound recording technologies highlighted the silences between sound and created a sensory awareness. When the film suddenly goes silent, we are made aware of our heartbeat, our own breathing, the fabric of the chair grazing against our forearms, the unbelievable unbelievably loud sound of the dude eating popcorn 3 rows behind us. Simmering in that silence, we are made aware of our body and of our conscious, deliberate choice of putting that body through these visceral reactions. And as the Book of Horror clearly states, after every silence comes a jump scare.